let's start with Jimmy Kimmel. So, when Jimmy Kimmel transitioned between being the Man Show host and Jimmy Kimmel, when he transitioned from that into being a late night host, it was like, okay, whatever, it happens. People start in a weird way, and then they can just kind of move into a different direction. Howard Stern did it. Howard Stern was a complete shock jock, and he went from being a shock jock to probably being the best interviewer in American history. I mean, he was, Conan O'Brien went from writing for The Simpsons to being maybe the best late night host of all time. David Letterman was a weatherman, so people can kind of transition. So it was strange to see, but it was whatever. Then when he turned into being like the voice of a lot of these like social justice and woke movements, and he was real anti-guns, and he was real big into universal health care, and he was crying all the time, and it was like, okay, if someone has forced Jimmy Kimmel to make a real move, someone has told him, hey man, it's not good enough that you're just on this side of the aisle, you have to be the voice. And then you start seeing Jimmy Kimmel, he's the host of every Emmys, he's the host of all these shows, he's the host of Whose Lines It Anyways, and it's Hollywood. I mean, it's Hollywood. This is the kind of stuff that happens, right? Play by my rules, and you'll get these opportunities. So, whenever that was happening, I was thinking, is this the same guy who ended every one of his shows by girls jumping on trampolines? Like, is this the same guy who had Andy Milonakis looking like a 13-year-old buying beer on the side of the road? Something's not adding up here. Like, we talk about Donald Trump, being president, and Donald Trump not being very presidential because he was the host of The Apprentice. Well, it's not very late night host, or not very woke of Jimmy Kimmel to be out there putting himself way out there when everybody knows his past. Crank Yankers had characters that were mentally challenged, overly racist, sexualized. Then the Man Show was the most 90s toxic masculinity. It was a Playboy magazine come to life, basically. And yeah, it worked for the mid-90s, but it's hard to be like, hey, Donald Trump, you're not very presidential when your resume includes girls jumping on trampolines getting soaked by a super soaker. And everyone knows Jimmy Kimmel's past of blackface and the Karl Malone things and all of that. So now that this is all surfacing, and somehow now it's all surfacing, Jimmy Kimmel's canceled. Bottom line, it hasn't happened yet, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to tell you right now, you do not walk back from what Jimmy Kimmel's done. And I'm not saying what Jimmy Kimmel's done is wrong. We talked about blackface. We talked about Jimmy Fallon blackface last podcast. But you don't, in this climate, walk back from saying the N-word, which Jimmy Kimmel did on multiple songs, from being in blackface a lot. It wasn't one skit. The Karl Malone skit was a recurring skit of Jimmy Kimmel's, right? You don't come back from all of that. And then the more that comes out, the worse it's going to get. I think Jimmy Kimmel will retire, personally. I mean, he's done, I think, 18 years or 19 years of late-night talk show. He's obviously good. I think if I was him, I would say, you know what? I've got a family. I've got my career. I did what I did. I probably did everything I ever wanted to do. It's a really good time for me to get out of this now because it's just going to get more woke. And the more people dig into the Man Show, the worse it's going to be. Trust me. That's what I would do if I was Jimmy Kimmel. He will be canceled. And it's really interesting to see these. I don't know what else to call them. So if you're taking offense to me calling them social justice warriors or woke or whatever, I don't know how else to get it across to the people I'm talking about. Hopefully, the listeners of this podcast know what I'm talking about. But it's very interesting to see those champions fall to their own devices, to their own traps. These people who cast this net of like purity, and anybody who's not pure gets caught in it, for them to get caught into the net. It's very weird. And it's not surprising. It's not surprising that not everyone is just good. Joe Rogan, they tried to cancel Joe Rogan this week. Joey Diaz, they tried to cancel him because guys are just really anyone, not guys, but guys, girls, whoever. If you have hours and hours and hours of them just riffing and talking and drinking and having fun and whatever, and you take clips out of context or you pile stuff together, yeah, you could probably have almost everyone on some pretty bad looks. Especially those who worked through the 80s, through the 90s, through the 2000s, into now. Because just like we said with Jimmy Fallon, it wasn't really thought of to be bad to do blackface in the early 90s or mid 90s. It wasn't really that big of a deal to play a mentally challenged person in a movie. And like, Ben Stiller seems like he was playing a mentally challenged person in every movie he did. You know, I mean, it's one of those deals where, would you do it now? No, you wouldn't do it now. But you wouldn't do a lot of stuff now. You know, I mean, time, it's hard to put the rules of today on the memories of the past. It's really dangerous to do that, I think. I mean, you hear stories about how it's like, oh, well, my dad let me, not my dad, but, well, and my dad. But it's like, my dad, gave me $2 to go down to the grocery store a block down the street and go buy a 6-pack of beer. And the grocery attendant, said, hey, who are you buying this for? And I said, oh, my dad. And they said, oh, tell him I said, hey. And he gave me the 6-pack of beer. And I'm 8 years old walking out with a 6-pack of beer. You hear those stories all the time. You're like, okay, well, that makes sense for the late 80s. That makes sense for the 70s or the early 90s. That doesn't make sense for 2020. It's just different. I mean, when I used to ride with my parents to the grocery store, a lot of the times, if it was nice outside, me and my sister would just sit in the back seat of the car, windows down, car off or on, whatever, depends on the time of the year. We'd sit in the back seat of the car, windows down, and we'd play on our Game Boys or just kind of hang out, look around, look in the parking lot. There was no worries about someone kidnapping me or, you would never do that nowadays. In 2020, could you imagine going to the grocery store and looking to your side and seeing a car with 2 kids in it, windows down, nothing wrong, not having heat stroke, but just seeing them out in the parking lot? They'd call it the cops, It's just different. I mean, when I grew up, my grandma drank martinis every night, and I would sit there and she'd let me have a sip, or she'd give me her olives, or I'd eat her olives, or eat the lemon out of it, whatever. She wasn't washing them off to get all the gin off. And I'm not saying to give your kids gin. That's not the point of this podcast. The point is that if you take things from the past and you just put them in a vacuum here, it's very different, right? It's like kid buys beer in 2020. Kids left in car while parents shop, 2020. Like those things look real bad when you change the lens to today, right? So the blackface and all that stuff, people will get canceled, and I do think it's ridiculous. I don't think it's correct. I think stuff changes. I don't want to spend the whole podcast on Jimmy Kimmel, but I think it's fair to say that things change. Taste or movies or TV. I mean, you see it all the time. And, so I'm not championing for Jimmy Kimmel. I'm not sitting here saying, let's give Jimmy another chance. I think he will get canceled, but it's just crazy to see the sword of justice or the sword of purity being swung at by these people, and then they end up the ones who it gets swung on.